the subject of our lecture today, enlightenment. Okay. Yeah. So we're going to start. Yeah. Okay. So the subject of our lecture today, enlightenment, is a highly controversial one, although you may not know that already. For it has been held responsible for a variety of contradictory things and reduced a number of political and economic projects. It has been held responsible for things like the Holocaust, for totalitarianism, for the manipulation and objectification of nature, for European imperialism and colonialism, for liberalism and secularism, as well as for the most aggressive aspects of capitalism. So on the one hand, Enlightenment is blamed for a crude nihilism as a result of its skepticism concerning absolute values. On the other hand, it is held accountable for unleashing a destructive individualism that is seen to have destroyed any sense of community globally. So Enlightenment has been accused of being insensitive towards moral conflicts and of having presented us with a naive assumption that all matters have clear logical solutions. And last but not least, of course, Enlightenment has been blamed for expounding all sorts of master narratives for sexism, Eurocentrism, moreisms, liberalism, and racism, to mention but a few. Thus, the task of excavating any potentials for enlightenment, as you read the texts that you will go through this week, is clearly faced with an immense number of obstacles, with an immense amount of obstacles. So despite many of these, what I suggested are critiques of enlightenment, or these what one would call these anti-enlightenment revisionisms, I want to suggest to you today that the Enlightenment as an intellectual movement does indeed leave us with an infinite and demanding task of reasserting the potency of thought and affirming intellectual discovery as something that is salutary rather than as a calamitous act. So the Enlightenment may have indeed succeeded in disenchanting the world, in shattering the great chain of being, as it is said, and in defacing the book of the world. But can all these really be reduced to a single calamitous result? And moreover, and I think this is what I wanted to drive through the lecture today, what is it in Enlightenment thought that remains essential for our historical present? It is important to begin with I want to make a few more notes on Enlightenment before getting into kind of very close reading of Kant's text. So the lecture will be really be focused on Kant's text, what is Enlightenment. But at the beginning, again, some few remarks about Enlightenment generally speaking. So it's important to note that the universality of Enlightenment is essentially premised on certain fissures, on breaks and splits. Thought is only possible through radical doubt, as you have seen with Descartes. So cogito and madness are somehow intertwined. Rationality can only be practiced through a recognition of its very limits, as you will see with Kant. Freedom and autonomy can only be achieved through a heteronymous act of recognizing the law, or of what Kant will call the categorical imperative. The subject is only human because of language, which in turn proves impossible to turn into a science, a matter that figures ranging from Condillac to Herder to Diderot were considering. And ironically, the Enlightenment that proposes itself as the rebirth of humankind closes with Hegel's declarations of the end of history, the end of philosophy, and the end of art. But let's look more closely a bit at the historical context and some of the defining Enlightenment propositions. The 18th century Enlightenment that I'm referring to was an intellectual and philosophical project formulated in the context of very turbulent times. Although the question of what is enlightenment that Kant's text seeks to respond to was raised in German circles, it was a very specific German debate, the ideas circulating at the time heavily influenced the French Revolution and were indeed influenced by it. The political and philosophical formulations put forth under the rubric of enlightenment in a way reacted to feudalism and absolutist monarchy and pivoted around exploring the relations between public discussion, religious faith, and political authority. More importantly, and most importantly, Enlightenment thought vehemently questioned customs, morals, and traditional ways of thinking. So indeed, although it was a European phenomenon, the Enlightenment, it cannot be reduced simply to a claim for the superiority and integrity of European values, or at least this is what I will try to, this is at least the way, the reading of Kant's text that I propose to give you today. Rather, Enlightenment is not reducible, in fact, to any identity position, neither Western, nor European, nor any other. So it's not reducible to what one would call a subjective position. Enlightenment, and as we'll see again with Kant's text, is precisely about relating negatively to oneself for the purpose of an openness to all others. In a sense, again, and this is a point that I really want to stress, it's a demand for universality and a transcendence of particularities. And I would like to maybe suggest, if I do end up getting to the later part of my lecture, that in fact one can even think of enlightenment as a certain sense of homelessness, accepting a sense of homelessness as the truest of all fates. Some of the key figures of enlightenment emerge from within the German context in Europe, but are influential for and influenced by the French and American revolutions. In the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, Europe witnessed the rise of modern bourgeois society, which, although released man from the fetters of feudalism, chained him into an image of the natural and social worlds as machines made of parts, and in which the individual served as a cog in the machine, something that you have already probably encountered with Adam Smith. So the naturalization of a mechanical understanding of the world, something as well that's exemplified in Francis Bacon's work that you may have read in 2 or 3 already, and the fixed laws that were revealed to govern the solar system since Copernicus, once projected onto human society in the ideas of the Leviathan, the Hobbesian and Lockean social contracts, and the Smithian political economy, proved to be highly problematic. And it's precisely to this mechanistic understanding that Kant reacts in his philosophical works. Kant describes the mechanization of the social world as a state in which, I quote him, immaturity has become natural to man. And I really want to stress from the beginning, this word immaturity, as it's translated into English from German, its first translation by John Richardson, the first translator of this text, was not immaturity, was nonage. And it's a word that falls out of English use to be replaced by dotage, or to be under a certain form of tutelage, to be represented by someone else. So immaturity, the word in its German meaning, is basically not having the ability to speak with one's mouth, to use one's own mouth to speak for oneself. So Kant described this mechanization of the social world as a state in which immaturity has become natural to man, and in which only rules and formulas epitomize the use of reason and suppress its potentials to somehow free man. Although we'll see freedom as a problematic thing for Kant as we in the later section of the lecture. This did not mean, however, that Kant did not recognize the almost real machine-like attributes of man. He realized that indeed we are finite beings who are essentially not free, but bound into a chain of causal determination, of a nexus of cause and effect, have no autonomy, and are simply thinking machines. But the question for Kant was, what to do with this knowledge of our own finitude, our own machine-like existence? So Kant calls this age of enlightenment an age of critique, as he called it, an age that demands that we think for ourselves. Another quote from Kant, even if it means thinking against ourselves, against what we take to be naturally constitutive of our very own subjectivities. So the legacy of enlightenment can be precisely summed up best in Kant's own words. Enlightenment is the exit from self-incurred immaturity, from the inability to speak for oneself to that of autonomous self-determination. In response to the question, what is enlightenment, and the increasingly pressing questions of the 18th century concerning the nature of political authority and the question of human freedom, Kant responded with a proposition for what enlightenment should or ought to mean, and not with a proposition for what enlightenment already is. So he never says this is an enlightened age. He says this is an age of enlightenment. You know, it's about what enlightenment ought to be, what it should be. Enlightenment, as he proposes it in the text, points somehow like a vector to a path of continuous intellectual pursuit despite all obstacles and in recognition of them. I want to show you kind of a clip from Werner Herzog's 1974 film called The Enigma of Caspar Hauser, about this this fellow Casper, who's found having been growing up in complete solitude, chained and barred from exiting a room all his life, he's found by these village people, and they all try to enlighten him. They try to civilize him, make him a civilized man. The church tries to convert him. The authorities try to question him. The children try to make him a plaything. The laborers mock him for some of his naivety. The town council takes advantage of him. You know, he's in this situation. Finally, there's this. Some people do take him in and decide to educate him, to teach him. And this scene is an interesting scene where he's visited by a professor of classical formal logic, and you know, he asks Casper a question that he would, against which he would measure the answer in terms of whether Casper has really, you know, reached a certain stage of enlightened thinking. And I want you to see this just to make a point after. Yeah.
First one.
It's just 5 minutes. It's in German, but you can read the subtitle. Okay. All right. Here it is. This is Casper, and of course notice the servant.
Du Kasper, der Professor ist extra hierher gekommen, um ein paar Fragen an dich zu richten. Weißt du, er will deine Denkfähigkeit prüfen. Er will wissen, was du in diesen 2 Jahren gelernt hast und ob du logisch denken kannst. Willst du ihm noch eine Frage beantworten, ja?
Ja, gut. Kasper, stell dir vor, hier ist ein Dorf. In dem Dorf leben nur Leute, die die Wahrheit sagen. Hier ist ein anderes Dorf. In diesem Dorf leben nur Leute, die lügen. Von diesem Dorf führt ein Weg auf dich zu, und von diesem Dorf führt ein Weg auf dich zu. Und du stehst an der Kreuzung. Es kommt ein Wanderer und du willst wissen, kommt er aus dem Dorf der Wahrheitssager oder kommt er aus dem Dorf der Lügner? Um dieses Problem zu lösen, logisch zu lösen, hast du eine einzige Frage zur Verfügung. Bitte sage mir diese Frage.
Das ist doch für den jungen Herrn viel zu schwierig. Das kann er doch gar nicht wissen.
Ich gebe zu, es ist nicht ganz einfach. Wenn er nämlich simpel fragt, kommst du aus dem Dorf der Wahrheit, dann würde derjenige, der aus dem Dorf der Wahrheit kommt, der Wahrheit gemäß mit Ja antworten. Derjenige aber, der aus dem Dorf der Lüge kommt, würde lügen und ebenfalls mit Ja antworten. Es gibt aber die Möglichkeit einer einzigen Frage, um dieses Problem zu lösen.
Ich finde das alles viel zu schwer, viel zu kompliziert.
Du hast die Möglichkeit, Kasper, mit einer einzigen Frage dieses logische Problem zu lösen.
Ich wüsste es auch nicht.
Kasper, wenn du es nicht weißt, werde ich sie dir sagen. Wenn du aus dem anderen Dorf kämest, würdest du dann mit Nein antworten, wenn ich dich fragen würde, ob du aus dem Lügnerdorf kommst? Über die doppelte Verneinung wird nämlich der Lügner zur Wahrheitsaussage gezwungen. Er wird nämlich über die doppelte Negation zu seiner eigenen Identität bestimmt. Das nenne ich Logik, über Argumentation zur Absolutheit.
Ja, ich weiß eine andere Frage.
Ja?
Es gibt keine andere Frage. Nach den Gesetzen der Logik gibt es keine andere Frage.
Nein?
Doch, ich weiß eine andere Frage.
Dann sag sie uns doch.
Ich würde denjenigen fragen, ob er ein Laubfrosch ist. Derjenige von Wahrheitsdorf würde sagen, nein, ich bin kein Laubfrosch, weil er die Wahrheit sagt. Der vom Lügnerdorf würde sagen, ich bin ein Laubfrosch, weil er gelogen hat. Und daher weiß ich, dass derjenige vom Lügener Dorf kommt.
Nein, nein, das ist keine Frage. Nein, das kann ich nicht anerkennen. Das hat nichts zu tun mit Logik. Logik heißt schließen und nicht beschreiben. Das ist doch nur Darstellung. Das ist doch nicht Logik. Das ist doch nicht das Zusammenfügen von... Ja, das Verständnis ist doch nicht das Ausschlaggebende. Der Schluss ist doch das Wesentliche. Als Professor der Logik und Mathematik habe ich nicht verstehen gelernt, sondern da habe ich schließen gelernt. Ich kann diese Frage nicht anerkennen.
Okay. Okay, sorry, just a second. Okay. So keep this Casper figure in mind as kind of, this kind of simplicity of his answer. What he proposes is ultimately, I think, the point that I've been trying to drive across is this courage to think for himself, despite all attempts at binding him into relations of tutelage, of, not accepting that there's a certain way to ask the question. And this is also what Kant technically does in his own philosophical works. So Casper somehow depicts for us the Kantian critique of this kind of what one would call a foundationalist picture of knowing. It's not the product of sciences that matters, but the very activity of knowing itself. So the importance of rereading figures like Kant today lies in understanding his text, ultimately the text that you will read this week, as an ethical and pedagogical exposition. The question, what is enlightenment, was initially put forth by a theologian and educational reformer called Johann Friedrich Zollner in December 1783, while questioning the advisability of civil marriage ceremonies in Germany. Soon enough, Zollner received responses in the newspapers from Moses Mendelssohn and Emmanuel Kant and multiple other figures. The debate in the newspapers centered on the issue of how much enlightenment of the citizenry was possible or desirable, and at what cost. It lasted for more than 10 years in the press, and by the time that Louis XVI was executed after the outbreak of the French Revolution, the question of enlightenment became increasingly intertwined with the question, or enlightenment became increasingly intertwined with asking whether the enlightenment of the public undermined authority and necessarily led to political turmoil. So it's important to clarify another point, that Kant's response to the question, what is enlightenment, in 1784, was in no way posed in a reflexive manner. And this is an important point. Kant was not simply reflecting on the question. In other words, he was not making the usual argument that is salient in our world, that knowledge is a reflective act that simply sheds light on the world, making it more visible to sight. Rather, Kant insisted that knowing is not simply about seeing, but about speaking without fear, without self-incurred cowardice and immaturity. And this is precisely what Kant the philosopher was doing. From his home in Königsberg, he wrote a journalistic essay meant for the newspapers and the public. And Kant, in this specific text, acted somewhat as a public intellectual himself. In it, he spoke actively in the world, rather than remaining bound to the position of a scholar in a closed, bounded academy. So the public use of reason, as Kant calls it, was put into practice in the very nature and dissemination of Kant's text, to which I want to now turn to with more detail. So although enlightenment as a word bears the meaning of illumination, in the text you are reading this week, Kant does not invoke images of light. Instead, speech and discourse are the most essential elements of enlightenment for him. What he demanded was not simply a world in which everything stood naked in the light of knowledge, but one in which it was possible to speak without fear. So the question for Kant was about the very limits of cognition, of thinking, and its possibilities. What can I know? Was Kant's question. In other words, knowledge for Kant does not involve seeing. Like scientific knowledge does not only involve empirical observation, knowing is not some form of inner light either. Its most important aspect is that it involves language, speaking, or discourse with and for others. And seeing and speaking are two very different acts in the world. Free speech for Kant is also not reducible to the liberal idea of free individuality and expression of opinion. So free speech for Kant is not about simply being free to have an opinion, but to be able to be free to use one's own understanding. And this use of understanding is premised on a number of steps for Kant. And you have these on this slide precisely from the Critique of Judgment. One must think for oneself. 2, one must think from the standpoint of everyone else. And 3, one must think always consistently. Only by being proficient at the first 2 can we be proficient at the third. So Kant claimed that we can only think freely if we think for ourselves in the company of others. And this is not simply a matter of formulating opinions, but one of formulating judgments. Thus, he does not adhere to the idea of introspection as a mode of thought. Another analogy maybe that may help clarify this. Philosophical thought that was rooted in reflection before Kant proposes his transcendental subject is best conceived of in terms of a process of mirroring, by which knowledge is understood as a secondary representation of being, and being is seen to exist in itself. Knowledge understood as a reflective mirror provides the subject with an image from the perspective of an other. Now, this reflective posture is based, for what Kant will say, on an optical delusion. Even in our modern form, let's say, of the photograph, we can see that the same thing happening, but with an unadded canniness. So I'm saying the photograph compared to an image in the mirror. We see ourselves somehow from the position of an other. So the objective appearance of the image in both the mirror, knowledge, and the photograph, for example, is based on an optical delusion. This is Kant's real critical gesture. He reveals that the past, and perhaps many future methods of philosophical reflection, were only optical delusions. Objectivity requires a certain displacement, and philosophy that begins with introspection or mirroring is always, for Kant, ensnared in this kind of abyss of introspection. So I want to use these 2 paintings, again, as an illustration maybe of this point. Hopefully this will help a little bit. Somehow these 2 paintings, although they come from very different times, they correspond to each other, and I think can provide us with a certain analogy to think of the Enlightenment's shifting of our understanding of cognition or the conditions of knowing, away from representation, from mere mirroring or mere reflexivity. We have on one side Diego Velázquez's Las Meninas from 1656, considered one of the best paintings in the history of Western art, and used to signify the rupture between the classical age of knowledge and the modern one. Now, something in this painting points to a new formation of knowledge, as many have noted, like Foucault and Lacan and others. It offers us a pictorial representation of how representation happens. Although the painting is capturing, it's hard to know what in fact is on what is in fact on the canvas in the painting, the one that you cannot see. The painter appears to be working on the canvas in the background. He's looking at us, looking at him. There's light flooding in from the window, making it possible to see on one side, while the canvas, what we can see, we see its back, remains invisible to us. There's a picture of a royal couple in the mirror in the back that is visible, but nobody is really looking at it. A door at the end of the room that is an exit right next to the mirror. A princess in the middle of the painting who appears to be the center of the image, the Infanta Margarita. It appears as the picture is a scene staged for the royal gaze, the king in the mirror way in the back. But the royal gaze is absent from the picture, yet somehow it's reflected inside it as something outside it. So the reflection in the mirror cannot, if you look at the real perspectival measures, it cannot be what's on the canvas. It cannot be that mirror image in the back of the room because of the sheer large scale of the canvas. So who is being represented for whom in this image? What I'm trying to get to here is that the apparent displacement of the object, or the shift of the position against a background caused by a change in observational positions, provides a new line of sight. Depends from where you choose to begin to look at this image. In the image of Las Meninas, we can see a ceaseless exchange or an infinite play between the positions of the viewer and the scene, the subject and the object. What you see in both images, this Las Meninas and the other one, Magritte's Human Condition, on the other side of the screen, is ultimately painting about painting. or a representation about representation. They both make the statement that art, or here the analogy with Kant may be thought or cognition, is not simply a mirror of the world, but a window into reality, a window that Magritte's painting represents almost as an obstacle, because you really can't get to the reality behind that painting over there unless you move the painting out of the way. Sorry, this is... okay. Yes. So they make the statement that art, as thought or cognition for Kant, is not a mirror of the world, but a window into reality, a window that Magritte's painting represents as an obstacle. For in order to see the depicted scene, the obstacle of the painting has to be somehow crossed. So these paintings stare around with the representation of representation, but in a way that doesn't reinforce an entrapment in representation, in a way that both intensifies representational illusion and calls it into question. Both paintings somehow challenge mere representational illusionism. And how does this link to Kant? So what Kant says about judgment, thinking for oneself, standpoint of others, thinking consistently, is not simply this kind of platitude that one should see things not only from one's own point of view, but also from the point of view of others. In fact, it is the reverse. If one's subjective view is an optical, and if the history of philosophy is nothing but the history of such reflections, then the history of philosophy is itself nothing but an optical delusion. So the reflection that Kant brought about is the kind that reveals that reflections in the past were optical delusions. The Kantian reflection, as a critique of reflection, is engendered by this parallax, this position from which only a difference in the apparent position of an object viewed from two sides is the way to grasp anything about the object. So the Kantian transcendental or parallax position is posited both against Descartes' cogito, as, I think, therefore I am, as thinking as a self-identical positive entity, and Hume's dissolution of the subject into a multitude of fleeting impressions. In a pre-Kantian universe, humans were simply humans, beings of reason, fighting the excesses of animal lust and divine madness, while only with Kant, and arguably maybe later on in German idealism, the excesses are the very cores of subjectivity itself. So in a sense, reflection can indeed make us aware of things like tradition, religion, family, society, and the state, points that Kant addresses in this text, but it can never really provide us with grounds for a release from them. For Kant, it is critique as a speech act and not as an introspective thought that is the sole method of enlightenment. Critique as a process of questioning what is and taking a stand from it. So a range of thinkers after Kant, for those of you in the social sciences or the humanities, like Hamann, Gadamer, Alasdair MacIntyre, Richard Rorty, have argued that Kant's idea of critique is simply impossible. It is impossible to step out from one's own traditions, from what are the main constitutive factors of the subject. Stepping out of one's traditions for these critics of Kant would be like stepping out of one's own language, stepping out of one's self. So what some have considered a mere impossibility, Kant posited as the very condition of enlightenment. Can one demand the impossible? Is a question that Kant did pause in his thought. So the beauty of contemplating the paintings we just saw on the screen lies precisely in their undefined purposiveness. We can see that they have been devised with a purpose in mind, although it is not entirely clear what the purpose is. Kant makes a similar argument about progress. Even if something like progress cannot be proven, we can still discern signs to indicate that it is possible. And this is a discussion he has in The Conflict of Faculties, for those of you who are interested. This discernment of the possibility of progress does not lead us to a resolute position, but to a continuous movement of critique that is transpositional and transversal, always moving by exiting the given limits of a given situation. What has been called Kant's transcendental critique is precisely this gesture of overturning an entire field of thinking, of not reducing the critique to either position in a given debate. So Kant always pits rationalism against empiricism, empiricism against rationalism, and vice versa. Thus, Kant's enlightenment after some of what I've mentioned, is not again reducible simply to a stage of development of European civilization, but is about the gesture of executing a critique from a place beyond the given binaries of any situation. In fact, we are compromised in reading Kant's text from the present when we reduce it to a teleology of progress. It is important, however, for us, despite all of what I'm saying, to be honest about the failure of Kant's predictions for society. Even in his own age, he recognized the lack of an age of enlightenment. Recall in the text that you will read, or watch it for it when you read the text, in Kant's words, he says, do we now live in an enlightened age? The answer is no, but we do live in an age of enlightenment. So there must be enlightened people for the age to be called an age of enlightenment. Even a revolution for Kant does not guarantee this. Does not guarantee, and I quote him, the true reform of ways of thinking, for it can bring down aristocratic despotism or oppression, but may not be able to overcome the inclinations towards cowardice and immaturity. So if we go to the very first sentence in the text, enlightenment is mankind's exit from self-incurred immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to make use of one's own understanding without the guidance of another. This immaturity, Kant argues, is self-incurred not because it is a lack of understanding, but because it is caused by a lack of courage and resolution to use one's understanding. So again, what Kant meant by immaturity, and as I mentioned before from the translation of the word, was the state in which one could not speak for themselves, where one literally has no mouth to speak with and requires an other to speak for them. By claiming that this immaturity is self-incurred, Kant located the source of the problem within the self. In order to exit the state of immaturity, one must be able to carry out a process of an ethical critique of the self. One must overcome social restrictions and processes of individuation. The ethical has to become a process of reconstitution of the self. There is no excuse in saying that someone has put you in a condition of immaturity. Kant writes in the introductory paragraph of the text, "It is so easy to be immature." So moving on in the text, Kant claims that it is formal academic education, the university, religion, and ideology that actively fend off maturity and make subjects fear it. The figures of the pastor, the scholarly book, and the doctor that you have in the last quotation on your handout are singled out by him as guardians who speak for the subject, as guardians who perpetuate a state of immaturity. I quote Kant here, the long quote from the end of your handout. "I have a book that has understanding for me, a pastor who has a conscience for me, a doctor who judges my diet for me, and so forth. Surely I do not need to trouble myself. I have no need to think. If only I can pay, others will take over the tedious business for me." Those guardians who have graciously taken up the oversight of mankind take care that the far greater part of mankind regard the step to maturity as not only difficult, but also very dangerous. End of quote. Thus, for Kant, immaturity had come to be considered the natural state of the subject, their understanding tethered to the ruse of mechanical and instrumental logic, like domestic animals tethered to carts, guided by them. So this path of exit from immaturity is only treaded at a very high cost by a very mere few. One could venture to say it's almost a suicidal act. Kant recognized that the cost of enlightenment is high, one that that many may not be willing to bear. However, he was adamant that true public enlightenment could only happen gradually, to quote him again, through the gradual reforms of the ways of thinking in society. He argued that even the overthrow of a monarch or an absolutist rule through a revolution would not be enough for enlightenment, because tyrannical power in society lies in the very structures of our thought. And again, a quote from Kant here, it's on your handout at the bottom. "A revolution may perhaps bring about the fall of an autocratic despotism and of an avaricious or overbearing oppression, but it can never bring about the true reform of a way of thinking. Rather, new prejudices will serve, like the old, as the leading strings of the thoughtless masses." End of quote. So after he makes this argument, Kant presents us with the true factor of enlightenment. And I quote him again, "the freedom to make a public use of one's reason in all matters." End of quote. Now, this is certainly one of Kant's most famous and most misinterpreted statements. Liberals, for one, have made it into an argument for the separation of rights and duties in the social contract. It has been interpreted as an argument about the separation of legality and morality. It has as well been interpreted as an excuse for reasserting reason over irrationality, as in the West over other cultures. However, if we look at Kant's text closely, if we employ a close philological lens in reading this text, we could reach entirely different and contradictory conclusions. And this is really, part of how one should read. If enlightenment has to do with the reform of a way of thinking, as Kant has already stated, and not in replacements of forms of representative powers in society with others, then enlightenment does not mean the further separation of the private from the public, but an overcoming of the private, of individual inclinations for something that is external to the self, outside it, foreign to it even. So nothing is required for enlightenment besides freedom, Kant tells us, the freedom to make public use of one's reason in all matters. Social and political institutions do not cease to command the subject to obey. Kant lists the state, the church, the Prussian king. They all command one to obey, and indeed one can obey. But in order to be free, the subject must undertake an act that shifts them from the particular conditions of their subjugation to a universal realm of reason. So this public use of reason does not simply oppose the individual to their particular surrounding community, but opposes particular communal institutional belongings against a universal exercise of reason. So the task of the public use of reason for Kant was not to answer questions and solve problems, but to redefine the very grounds of problems, to ask about the horizon of meaning which is always already there, structuring our approach to reality, and of which we are unaware. So while Kant's contemporaries like Moses Mendelssohn were willing to concede that there might be certain unhappy circumstances in which philosophy must remain silent, Kant was uncompromising in his insistence that the public use of reason should never be restricted. He insisted on arguing against the restriction of the public exercise of reason. Public exercise of reason is an act that one does as a scholar, he says, before the entire public of the reading world, and not within the closely bound academic university institution. It is an act undertaken as a participation in the universal. So while the private use of reason, Kant describes as anything done as part of a certain mechanism, and it's very important. This is how he distinguishes the private from the public here, use of reason. So private use of reason is anything that's done as part of a mechanism, such as in a civil post, in a university, in a school, in a society of clergymen, in the army. In order for a subject to practice a public use of reason, they must transcend their particular position. So a clergyman who is critical of the system of the church can address the world as a scholar. The citizen who is critical of the taxation system can critique it from the position, again, of the scholar. The same goes for any other subject position in the apparatus of the social order. Kant explained, and I quote him again, "The touchstone of everything that can be concluded as a law for a people lies in the question, could a people have imposed such a law upon itself?" End of quote. And even if a people have instituted some law upon itself, law is always instituted for a brief time to introduce order and an expectation of what is better. That's why for Kant, men work themselves bit by bit out of immaturity, or of being unable to speak for themselves, and at different paces. Not everybody is able to adhere to the public use of reason. It comes at a very high cost. But however, Kant is neither proposing here a liberal idea, neither is he proposing some kind of, quasi-totalitarian idea. He's arguing that enlightenment is a qualitative transformation, not a quantitative one. The task of enlightenment is infinite, and humankind are perplexing creatures, finite and restricted to certain mechanisms. But there's a dual role that subjects must play. They must be passive, on one account, as machines following natural law, and active as ethical political subjects. This split nature of the subject, of the modern subject, is the very same grounds for their freedom. Karl Marx, whom you will read in the next couple of weeks, takes Kant's categorical imperative, the imperative to act in a way in which the highest aim for man is man himself, or woman herself, and extends it in his own critique of capitalist political economy. And I want to quote here from Marx. The criticism of religion, begun with Kant, ends with the teaching that man is the highest being for man, hence with the categorical imperative to overthrow all relations in which man is a debased, enslaved, forsaken, despicable being. End of quote. So the plight of the modern subject, in its Kantian sense, is precisely this. They must obey the commands of social and political institutions, and in this obedience there is essentially no freedom. And here it's important to note the stark contrast with figures like Adam Smith, Thomas Hobbes, that while they presumed the pursuit of self-interest to be the core of enlightened society, Kant argued that it is this very self-interest that paradoxically limits freedom. So the paradox for Kant, however, again here, it doesn't, you know, it's not so, let's stop it. It's not so, the paradox about freedom for Kant is that a high degree of civic freedom appears advantageous for spiritual freedom, even if it places restrictions on it, and a low degree of civil freedom, of argue as much as you want to but obey, creates the room for spiritual freedom to spread to its full capacity. And this is for him a paradox. Spiritual freedom for Kant is not equivalent to free thinking. And civic freedom does not appear to be conducive to true free thinking, true enlightenment. Frederick the Great may be a model prince, the 18th century may be in a true need for some degree of spiritual freedom, but remember, it does not represent an enlightened age, but a potential for enlightenment that has to be actualized and not restricted to a form of religious freedom on one hand and an enlightened monarch on the other. Neither spiritual freedom nor freedom induced by a government are forms of true enlightenment, in which the public use of reason may question all laws that were already given. So for Kant, the very idea that everything is determined by natural cause is made possible by the position that brackets freedom. And conversely, only when determination by natural cause is bracketed can the idea of freedom intervene. That's why it's irreducible to either of these positions. This is the kind of the parallax position from which to look at things for Kant. So the key for Kant is that one cannot explain everything from one and the same positionality, and that one should always seek a universality. And universality for Kant is not simply a coalition of common senses, but has to go against plural common senses, while still taking others into consideration. Okay, so I'm not sure I have time to go through the rest of the lecture. I'll try, and you can just, I suppose, start walking out whenever you feel like doing that. Not too long. So I want to illustrate this point with a story of a familiar figure to us. Sophocles' Oedipus the King, who re-emerges in the modern era as a figure for our infatuation with subjectivity. And Kant, as we have seen, was a thinker who provides us with an unsurpassed description of the deep structure of subjectivity. I would like to leave you with a metaphor for thinking of enlightenment as a sense of homelessness, or as an internal split in subjectivity that leads to a participation in a universal. Sophocles' Oedipus Rex, the infamous Oedipus, who killed his own father and married his mother, depicted really beautifully here by Gustave Moreau in 1864. It's very important to note that Oedipus is the story of a dislocated individual, expelled from home, from human society, even deprived from a grave. Oedipus, as an infant, is abandoned by his parents, a king and a queen, when an oracle revealed to them that he would slay his own father. Taken in and raised by a shepherd and his wife, Oedipus grows to know about his cursed fate, that he would mate with his mother and slay his own father. And in his attempt to escape this fate, he ends up somehow consummating it unknowingly. He leaves his hometown only to meet his real father as a stranger on the road, fight him, and slay him, after which Oedipus is challenged by the Sphinx to answer a riddle that had led hundreds to their death for their inability to answer it. The Sphinx asked Oedipus, "What walks on 4 feet in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 3 at night?" Oedipus answered, "Anthropos, or man. As an infant, he crawls on all 4s. As an adult, he walks on 2 legs. And in old age, he uses a walking stick." The Sphinx, astounded, kills herself, and Oedipus is crowned the king of the city of Thebes and wed to his own mother. All this happens without the characters themselves knowing the plot. He does not know what's going on. Oedipus had responded to the Sphinx without knowing what he was really doing. When he was told the truth, so here I'm trying to say Oedipus somehow already being weaved into a nexus of cause and effect, causal determination, which is where precisely what I was discussing before, the need to bracket causal determination in order for freedom to be possible, and to do it also, to bracket freedom in order for one to be able to think causal determination. So Oedipus had responded to the Sphinx without knowing what he was really doing. When he's told the truth of what he had done later on in the myth, Oedipus blinds himself. He gouges out his own eyes. This is a famous depiction of this. Through blinding himself, and in the words of those witnessing the event, the chorus in the tragedy, Oedipus refused to recognize himself in his own acts, but only to recognize himself in his blindness. After all, he had always been blind to the truth of his actions. By gouging his eyes out, and not simply killing himself, he does not identify with his own destiny, a subject consumed by guilt, but with what was driving him all along from within, his very own blindness. Oedipus's tragedy, or indeed his ethical imperative, is not that he emerges as a subject who recognizes his own subjectivity retroactively. For Oedipus does not recognize himself as guilty. He does not choose to kill himself to absolve his guilt. On the contrary, Oedipus emerges as a reified object, a blind outcast who refuses to be guilty. He refuses to be guilty precisely because he was robbed already of all of his subjectivity. He was given over from the very beginning to a social order. Oedipus was already spoken for by the law of his society. He was by the law of his society. His response when he is told the true story of his life was, "I'm not guilty." Oedipus's gouging of his eyes, despite his refusal to identify with the path of causal necessity that had led to his tragedy, is an act in which he recognizes that he is a free subject only when he acknowledges that as a subject he is the result of a long chain of causal determination, causes and effects. As a subject, I can only grasp the importance of freedom through recognizing the miserable fact that it is best not to be born from the beginning. But now I must somehow choose despite that. So the knot of Oedipus's story in his moment of confrontation with the Sphinx, where he must speak, but no one can guarantee for him in advance that his answer will be right, yet Oedipus ventures an answer. He acts as a true enlightened subject. He offers his words, musters the courage to speak, and anticipates the truth. However, it is revealed to us in the structure of the myth that his words to the Sphinx end up binding him to a predetermined path. He becomes a hostage of his own words. When Oedipus is made to see what he was blinded from, he chooses his blindness again and anew. The choice of blindness is an attempt to exit the order of events that had determined his path since he uttered his words to the Sphinx. In a sense, Oedipus's only act is his rendering of himself a remainder, an object of what he did not know. Oedipus, I'm suggesting, is a true Enlightenment figure, for he inscribes for us the conflicted core of subjective positions and their irreducibility to identifiable social roles. The structure of Oedipus's acts, of his response to the Sphinx, of his blinding of himself, shares the structure with all discoveries, all shocks of truth that restructure fields of given knowledge. His acts are ethical because they make the advent of ethics possible, not because they consummate a previous ethical order. So, final words, and I think it's done. Enlightenment as an act, as speech, and not as introspection, as critique, shares a similar thrust with this Oedipus story, for it has to be undertaken as an act that overcomes a divided subjectivity. If in our present so-called postmodern times we increasingly find ourselves fearful, haunted by ghosts of ancient authorities and masters, ideals that haunt us from the past, if we increasingly find ourselves robbed of the capacity to speak against our own fears, the Enlightenment question would be, what must we sacrifice and what must we preserve in order to exit this current state of immaturity? Okay, thanks for listening.